Before we dive into these scary stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy true horror content every week. My best friend Amber and I were driving across the state to visit her sister for the weekend. The plan was to split the drive, stop for gas and snacks along the way, and make it there by nightfall. Nothing fancy, nothing stressful, but plans rarely go as expected, as we were about to find out. We were about 3 hours into the drive when Amber's phone buzzed on the dashboard. The screen lit up, showing an unknown number. Amber glanced at it and shrugged. "Spam call," she muttered, hitting decline. I didn't think much of it. We'd both been getting a lot of those recently. Random calls from strange numbers that either hung up or tried to sell something. It was just part of life now. The call came again about 20 minutes later. Same number. Amber declined it again, this time with an annoyed grunt. "You could block it," I suggested, taking a sip of my soda. "Yeah, but I kind of want to see if they keep trying. Like, what's the record for the most annoying spam call ever?" We laughed about it and moved on. The radio was playing. The road stretched endlessly before us, and the incident slipped into the back of my mind. But then the third call came. It was an hour later, and we were cruising through a particularly desolate stretch of highway. No streetlights, no other cars, just an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the trees. When Amber's phone buzzed again, she groaned loudly. "Oh my God, this number is relentless." "Answer it," I said, half joking. "Tell them to screw off." She grinned and picked up the phone, hitting the speaker button. "Hello?" At first, there was silence. Then, a low, distorted crackling noise came through like a bad connection. Amber frowned and leaned closer to the phone. "Hello? Who is this?" The crackling grew louder. It sounded almost like breathing. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Hang up," I whispered. Amber hesitated but eventually ended the call. She laughed nervously, but her expression was uneasy. Creepy. Probably just some prank or a butt dial. "Let's block the number," I said, feeling a knot of discomfort in my stomach. She nodded and blocked it, but as soon as she did, her phone buzzed again. A different number this time. Amber stared at the screen. "Okay, this is getting weird." She declined the call, but the phone buzzed again within seconds. Another number. And another. It was like whoever, or whatever, was calling us wouldn't give up. Amber's face had lost its earlier amusement, and I could feel the tension growing in the car. We tried to ignore it, but the calls kept coming. They were relentless, each one from a different number. Amber eventually turned her phone off and tossed it onto the back seat. "There, problem solved," she said in a funny way, but it wasn't. Not even 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I froze, staring at the screen. The number was unlisted. Amber looked at me with wide eyes. "Don't answer it." I didn't plan to, but the buzzing didn't stop. It went on for so long that it was almost worse than picking up. I finally grabbed the phone and declined the call. The buzzing stopped for about 30 seconds. Then it came again and again. I was freaking out now. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered. Amber turned to look out the window. Maybe we should stop somewhere. A gas station or something." "There hasn't been one for miles," I said, glancing at the GPS. The next rest stop was nearly 50 miles away. My phone buzzed again, and this time I swiped to answer. "What do you want?" I shouted into the phone. Silence. Then, that same distorted crackling noise came through. It sounded clearer this time. It wasn't breathing. It was a voice, a whisper, barely audible, but undeniably human. We were able to make out the words, "You can't run." I threw the phone into the passenger seat like it was on fire. Amber stared at me. "What do we do?" "Ignore it, we keep driving. This is creeping me out," I said. "We need to get to a town, somewhere with people." Amber pressed the gas pedal, and the car surged forward. Then my phone buzzed again. And again. And again. Amber's phone, which she'd turned off, suddenly lit up in the back seat. The screen was blank. "What the hell?" Amber whispered. I grabbed her phone, trying to turn it back off, but it wouldn't respond. The light just stayed there, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Then, all at once, it went dark. The car's headlights flickered. "Did you see that?" Amber said. I could tell she was starting to panic. "It's just the car," I said, though I didn't believe it. "It's probably nothing." The headlights flickered again, then went out completely. The car plunged into darkness, and Amber slammed on the brakes, bringing us to a screeching halt. We sat there in silence with the engine idling. The darkness outside was suffocating. My phone buzzed again. This time I didn't answer it. I just stared at the screen. The number was still unlisted, but the message was clear. Whoever, or whatever, was calling us wasn't going to stop. Then Amber gasped. "Look," she whispered, pointing out the windshield. In the faint moonlight, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, just a few feet in front of the car. It didn't move. It just stood there looking at us. Amber threw the car into reverse, but before she could hit the gas, the figure took a step forward, then another. I screamed, "Go! Drive!" Amber hit the gas, swerving around the figure and speeding down the road. The headlights came back on, illuminating the highway ahead of us. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. The calls stopped after that. We drove straight to Amber's sister's house, barely speaking the rest of the way. When we finally arrived, we collapsed on the couch, too shaken to explain what had happened. The next morning, Amber checked her phone. All the missed calls were gone, wiped from her call log. My phone showed the same thing. It was like the calls had never happened. But we both knew the truth. It started out as a completely normal road trip. I'd been planning it for months, a solo drive up the coast to clear my head and get away from the monotony of daily life. I loaded my car with snacks, a cooler of drinks, and a carefully curated playlist for the hours ahead. It was supposed to be peaceful, even boring. It wasn't. The first time I noticed the beat-up old sedan, I was halfway through the first day of the trip. It pulled into the same gas station as me, a little worse for wear, with chipped paint and a deep dent on the passenger side door. I wouldn't have paid much attention to it if it hadn't been for the driver. He was a wiry man with hollow cheeks and sharp eyes that seemed to dart around like he was expecting something, or someone. He wore a ratty baseball cap pulled low over his face. He pumped gas into his car while looking over his shoulder repeatedly. I didn't think much of it. Lots of people are paranoid. Maybe he'd had a rough morning, or maybe he was just naturally jumpy. I finished fueling my car, grabbed a soda, and got back on the road. But a couple of hours later, I noticed the sedan again. I was on a lonely stretch of highway with nothing around but endless fields and the occasional billboard. It was the kind of road where you could go 20 minutes without seeing another car. And yet, when I glanced in my rearview mirror, there it was, the same dented sedan a few car lengths back. I shrugged it off. Coincidences happen. But it stayed with me. Every turn I made, every rest stop I pulled into, that car seemed to show up within minutes. The third time it happened, I started to feel uneasy. By sunset, I'd convinced myself that I was imagining things. Maybe it wasn't the same car. Lots of sedans look alike, and it wasn't like I was being chased or anything. Still, I decided to stay the night in a small roadside motel rather than push forward. The parking lot was nearly empty when I pulled in, but a few minutes later, as I checked in at the front desk, the sedan rolled in too. My stomach sank. I watched through the window as the man got out of the car and leaned casually against it, lighting a cigarette. He didn't seem to notice me, or if he did, he didn't show it. But something about his presence sent chills down my spine. That night I couldn't sleep. My room faced the parking lot, and every so often I'd peek out the window to check on the sedan. The man was gone, but the car was still there. At some point, my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, slipped on my sneakers, and quietly stepped outside. The night air was cool, and the lot was silent. The sedan looked even worse up close. The dent I'd noticed earlier was deeper than I'd thought, and there were long scratches along the trunk like someone had taken a crowbar to it. The back of the car smelled faintly metallic, like rust, or something worse. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then leaned in closer to the trunk. There was dried mud caked around the edges and what looked like a smear of blood. But surely that couldn't be. I stepped back quickly. I didn't know what I'd expected to find, but suddenly, I didn't want to know. I hurried back to my room and locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, the sedan was gone. I told myself it was over, that I'd probably just let my imagination get carried away. But as I merged back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong. That's when the radio interrupted my thoughts. Police are still searching for Matthew Curtis, who is wanted in connection with multiple homicides across the state. Curtis is believed to be driving a dark sedan, last seen heading north on Highway 17. Authorities are urging anyone with information to come forward. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and quickly searched for news about the man. His mugshot came up immediately. Those same hollow cheeks, those darting eyes. It was him. It was the man from the gas station, from the motel, from the dented sedan. I felt sick. Suddenly everything clicked. The blood on the trunk, his paranoid glances, the way he'd seemed to follow me. I hadn't imagined it. He really had been following me, and now I had a horrible suspicion about why. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I'd seen the car and the man? That I'd noticed blood on the trunk but hadn't done anything about it? They already knew what he looked like, what he was driving. I didn't have anything new to add. Still, I couldn't shake the thought, what had been in that trunk? I drove the rest of the trip in a haze, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the sedan appear behind me again. It never did, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was there a body in his trunk? To this day, I'll never know for sure, but deep down, I think I already do. The drive home from my cousin's wedding was supposed to be an uneventful, boring 6-hour stretch of highway, cutting through some of the most desolate landscapes in the state. I had left the reception late, too late in hindsight. By the time I got on the road, the sky had turned black, and the only light visible came from my car's headlights. The first few hours passed uneventfully, as you'd expect. Just me, the road, and the faint hum of the radio playing static-filled oldies. The occasional truck would roar past. But then, about 3 hours into the drive, I noticed something odd. It started as a flicker in my rearview mirror, a pair of headlights in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another car, probably heading the same way I was. But the lights didn't seem to get closer. They just hovered there, at the edge of visibility, no matter how fast or slow I drove. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were driving cautiously on these dark, winding roads. Or maybe it was a trick of the terrain, with the car being farther away than it seemed. But no matter how much I rationalized, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. An hour later, the headlights were still there. Always the same distance behind me. I tried everything, speeding up, slowing down, even pulling off to the shoulder for a moment to let them pass. But they never did. And that's when I noticed something else. The car, if it was a car, never turned, never dipped its beams or wavered on the road. It just stayed there, unwavering, like it was glued to me. By the 4th hour of driving, I was sweating. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The unease had turned to fear, and my mind began to wander into darker territory. What if it wasn't just some late-night driver? What if they were following me and meant me harm? I laughed nervously to myself, trying to shake the thought. "You're just tired," I muttered under my breath. But the laughter died in my throat when the car behind me suddenly sped up. The headlights grew larger, brighter, closing the gap between us in a matter of seconds. My heart started pounding in my chest as I prepared to be overtaken. But just as the car approached my rear bumper, it slowed down again, retreating to its previous distance. It was playing with me. By the fifth hour, I was nearing panic. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, dark and desolate, with no other vehicles in sight. The occasional exit ramp tempted me, but each one led to the same thing: pitch-black nothingness. I didn't dare pull off the highway. At least here I was still moving. Then I saw a gas station up ahead, the first sign of civilization in miles. Its neon sign flickered weakly, but it was a beacon of hope. I pulled into the station and threw the car into park. The headlights behind me didn't follow. Relief washed over me as I sat there, catching my breath. Maybe it really was just a coincidence. Maybe I'd let my imagination run wild. But as I stepped out of the car, I felt it. That prickle on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced around the empty parking lot, but there was no one there. Just the wind, rustling the trees in the distance. I hurried inside the gas station. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as I grabbed a coffee and a snack. "Busy night?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He shook his head. "Not out here. You're the first person I've seen in hours." I forced a smile and paid for my items, but as I turned to leave, he called after me. "Hey, you sure you're okay? You look nervous." I hesitated. "It's nothing. Just some weird car on the highway. Probably nothing." The clerk's expression darkened. "Weird how?" I swallowed hard. "It's been following me. For hours. But it didn't pull in here, so I guess it's gone now." He didn't respond right away, just stared at me with a frown. Finally, he said, "You should be careful. Some strange things happen out here." I didn't want to know what he meant. I thanked him and left, trying to push his words out of my mind. When I got back to my car, the relief I'd felt earlier vanished. There, in the distance, were those headlights. They'd waited for me. I got back on the road, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. This time, the car didn't keep its distance. It stayed close, so close that its headlights filled my rearview mirror, blinding me. I slammed on the gas, desperate to get away, but the car matched my speed effortlessly. I was going 90 now, the road blurring around me, but no matter how fast I went, the car stayed inches from my bumper. And then, suddenly, the headlights disappeared. Not in a "the car slowed down, disappeared" way, but in a just completely disappeared from 1 second to the other kind of way. I glanced in the mirror, super confused. The road behind me was empty. I let out a shaky breath, slowing down slightly. Maybe they'd finally given up. But they hadn't. The impact came out of nowhere. My car lurched forward as something rammed into me from behind. I screamed, gripping the wheel as I fought to stay on the road. The headlights were back, brighter than ever, pushing me, forcing me to speed up. I was going 100 now when the headlights swerved to the side. I looked out my window and saw it, a black car, sleek and featureless, pacing me. But there was no one behind the wheel. My blood turned to ice as the car swerved closer, nudging me toward the guardrail. I yanked the wheel to the left, narrowly avoiding a crash, but the car kept coming like a maniac. I don't know how long it went on. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning. But eventually, the road curved, and I saw a truck stop up ahead. I swerved into the parking lot, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. The black car didn't follow. It vanished into the night, finally leaving me alone. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally got out of the car, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. The truckers at the stop gave me strange looks as I stumbled inside. I wanted to tell them what had happened, but how could I? Who would believe me?